Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday. It's been a rough week. I am on the home stretch, so bear with me in my brain. But today we're going to talk about exercise considerations for patients with MS. And today, this topic, the research is still not very well defined. There are a lot of articles talking about exercise in general for people with multiple sclerosis, but there's not a set guideline or a set intensity or a set of what you need to do specifically for people with MS. So, exercise studies in people with MS have really not controlled very well the intensity or the duration or the frequency, so it all kind of varies. So just wanted to give you that heads up before we went into this topic. Now, the first thing you need to consider when you're exercising with someone with MS. So last week we talked about the fatigue, and the fatigue and the pseudo attacks are brought by stress, exercise, elevation in core temperature. So that's the one that I want to talk about. So that increase in body temperature, because when we exercise, obviously our core temperature rises, right? So before we start going there, another disclaimer that I have to tell you is intervention strategies for people with MS might be different than for your other neurological diagnosis. So interventions for just general neuropopulation might not be appropriate for your patients with MS. So you have to consider that, okay? So now I want to talk about going back to the rising core temperature. So before we start talking about exercise in people with MS, the fundamental problem of rehab with people with MS is that thermosensitivity. So that rise in body temperature, which will worsen the physical performance of the patient with MS as the core temperature rises. And remember, when we have this change, there will be a decreased speed of that nerve conduction. So then what do? And let's remember that temperature rise can be extrinsic and can be intrinsic. Intrinsic, I mean raise of body temperature, or can be extrinsic, which is the room very warm, or is the heater on, or things like that, okay, in case of the winter time. So just remember that temperature rise can be both, okay? Now, then what do we do if this is the problem with patients with MS? Well, here I'm going to introduce you the cooling therapy. So using the cooling garments. Now, this can be maybe a cool towel. I've seen some patients wear some cooling vests. I've seen patients wear like a little fan, like the ones here, like a little like necklace with cooling vests. So it can even be worn before the activity to pre-cool the body. That way they're able to tolerate exercise better. So if you pre-cool the body, you're able to do more exercise. So it's going to take longer to reach that temperature that will limit the activity, okay? So then it'll lead to more volume of exercise. Now, there are lots of studies, and to be honest with you, when I was going over this as part of my studying, I was like, what are they recommending? There's so many research, and mostly all of them says more research is needed on this topic. But there are two things that I want to talk about. When you are approaching a person with MS and you are rehabbing them, there are either two ways you can approach the exercise. One, if you want to do continuous exercise, you make sure that you keep it at a 45 to 60% heart rate max. So maybe like not too low, but maybe like low mod. If you're doing continuous, maybe like 20 minutes. But what the new research says now, and it's growing, talks about your intermittent training, which means taking breaks, literally. So AKA interval training, fractionated training, interspersed periods of exercise with periods of rest. Because when you're resting, it will allow the core temperature to lower. And then that leads to greater dosage of exercise. So that's something that it's now coming out in the research, that intermittent training. Now, in terms of the intensity, they're looking at intensities about 80 to 90% for that interval. But again, it has to be a small on time and then your rest, the long rest time. So just to give you an example, there was a study that I was reading and they were comparing continuous and intermittent 6-minute walk. So the continuous group, they just walked for the 6 minutes. The intermittent group, they would rest every 2 minutes, and then they would compare the total distance. So the group that did the continuous distance, they were able to walk 998 feet versus the other group that rested, they were able to walk 1,126 feet. Now, there was another study that compared strengthening. So if we're going to do the resistance training, there were two groups. So one group, they would perform one straight leg race every 3 seconds. So it was like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then the intermittent, they would do 2 straight leg races, then 5-second rest, and then again 2 straight leg races. So the continuous group, they were able to do 31 straight leg races. And the intermittent group, they were able to do 114 straight leg races. So here again, this research is new that intermittent training, well, to be honest, I don't know if it's new, but it's coming up now. Like this intermittent training, it's now something that they're promoting more. So again, this intermittent training is basically let them exercise at a higher intensity because remember, we need to meet the dose for the effect. Now, you are putting them at a higher intensity for a short period of time and letting them rest so that body temperature would stay where you want it to be, preventing that fatigue, preventing that decreased nerve conduction, and then letting them reach that dosage. So let's say if you want to do your strengthening, they are recommending, let's say if you want to do 3 sets of 10, you flip it and you do maybe 10 sets of 3. And then with a rest break. So greater volume of strength training can occur if breaks are taken, okay? So again, so for intensity, as I mentioned, for strengthening, around 85 to 90% 1RM, depending on, what they tolerate, but push those rest breaks, okay? Now, before it was mentioned, like in the past, that lower loads would presumably limit fatigue, but higher loads will lead to greater central nervous system activation and greater neural drive. So that's what they're pushing now. Now, during their rest breaks, what you can do is have them do range of motion, stretching. Remember, flexibility is the cornerstone of mobility. These patients will need their stretches. If they're having foot drop, don't just think tibial is anterior weakness. No, think about maybe is the plantar flexor pretty tight? Do I need to stretch it? So when you stretch, you also want to strengthen the antagonist. So if you're going to stretch the plantar flexors, strengthen the dorsiflexors as well. So don't forget about the antagonist, but also don't ignore the flexibility. Okay, so with MS, stretching is never enough. You can always stretch. Okay, so now we're going to talk about your respiratory training. So remember that these patients, as they are demonstrating higher levels of disability, they will also demonstrate their respiratory problems. And according to some research, there are more obstructive disorders, respiratory disorders versus restrictive respiratory disorder. So just to remind you, obstructive is problem with exhalation, and then restrictive is when you have trouble inhaling. So with patients with MS, we need to help them with their obstructive disorder. So one exercise, obviously you want to do your respiratory exercises, but one that I learned was your phonation. And it's easy as like inhaling and then just like saying because you're exhaling air. One thing that I learned is that if they can do the inhaling and then for 20 seconds or more, they're good. But if they can do it for more than 15 seconds, or they're doing it for less or equal to 15 seconds, you should be worried. And you can incorporate this exercise. Now, this, you might seem like, oh, this is something maybe speech therapy will be doing. But no, I mean, respiratory muscles are part of the muscular system. Your inspiratory muscles are your external intercostals and your diaphragm. Your exhalation muscles are your abs and your internal intercostals. So you're working on those muscles, okay? Now, if you are exhaling, you're eccentrically working your diaphragm, because your diaphragm is an inhaler. Okay, so you're eccentrically working your diaphragm as you exhale. So remember, eccentric sometimes are better than concentric. Okay, so that's another tip that I can give you. So it was a lot of information. I hope this helped you guys understand like how to approach exercise in MS. Just remember, cooling, always cool, like you cool and like cooling. Rests, intermittent training, if you're going to do continuous, lower intensities. If you're going to do intermittent training, higher intensities with lots of breaks. And respiratory exercises, phonation. I hope this was a good information for you guys, and I will see you next time.